Hi, I'm Ari, I'm the Oak Witch, and in today's video I'm going to be discussing the concept, the mundane before the magical, from an animist's perspective. Within spirituality and magical circles, you'll most likely have come across the phrase before, the mundane before the magical. And I see this emphasised all over Discord circles and on Twitter, and for the most part it is really important, it's really crucial. However, I think sometimes the emphasis of this phrase can lead to a little bit of misconception, and this video is basically just going to be a talk piece. This is going to be me discussing this concept and perhaps inspiring a new way to look at the mundane world. Before I get into explaining my animist perspective to this concept, I want to stress that I do think it is an important concept. I'm not rejecting it and I'm not saying that it's not important. It is vital that, for example, before conducting a healing spell, you've consulted a doctor. You know, if you have something health-wise that is bothering you, you don't just resort to magic straight away. You need to go see a doctor, go see your local GP, go and get something checked by a professional, a medical professional, before you resort to magic, because as spiritual people we shouldn't reject or completely throw away the idea of modern medicine, you know, science. So it's vital in this context. Another example is, you know, before you ingest any plants, before you ingest any herbs that you've foraged or that you've bought online for your witchy supplies, before you ingest it, or before actually sometimes even touching it, have you researched the plant's toxicology, the ecology? Have you just looked at what the plant is? You know, for some plants the difference between a cure and a poison is the dosage. So it's really important in this sense to look at the mundane of the plant before the magical. And yes, this is important. However, as a animist and as a witch who practices folk magic, I don't necessarily see the mundane as entirely separate from the magical. My animist perspective allows me to see life, energy and spirit in everything, and I think that that in itself is inherently magical. For me, when I go to a tree, it's not just a tree, you know, it is life, it is a spirit. And even just standing there and perceiving the way it moves in the wind and the way that it can almost breathe, and scientifically, yes, you can equate this to photosynthesis, for example, but also there is this magical inherent spirit within it which I can feel when I touch the trunk, or the trunk? Yeah, the trunk! The bark of the tree. Is something that I can feel, and I think that that's something which maybe I can't necessarily explain scientifically or rationally or logically, but it's something that I feel and it's something that is there. So for me, that is magical, and that is just a tree, you know, that is a mundane object, as you were. So I think trying to separate them sometimes is a little bit confusing. How do you separate the physical object of the tree and the tree spirit? For me, they're one and the same. So when we get into this idea of, oh, the mundane before the magical, sometimes I worry that we are placing too much of a division between the two, when actually sometimes some people, perhaps not everyone shares the same thinking as me, but some people definitely do not see the two as entirely separate. And I believe that this line of thinking actually goes even further, especially when we're looking at magical practices. For example, cleansing. Cleansing is something which, you know, we can see in smoke cleansing or sound cleansing and very energetic cleansing. You know, these are things which are magical and are quite obviously witchy or spiritual. But for me, when I'm doing my cleansing routine, I'm hoovering my floor, I'm dusting my shelves, I'm opening the window, not just to let the stagnant energy fly out and go out and not linger in the room, but also just to get the airflow, that mundane action of the air flowing through the window, allowing my room to have fresh air. That for me is cleansing, and that is a mundane action, but for me it's also magical. It goes hand in hand. You know, I can't do a cleanse with smoke and just have that. Like, it doesn't feel like I'm actually cleansing that way. I need the combination of the mundane and the magical for it to be magical. Am I making any sense? I feel like I made no sense there. So for me, I think that, you know, actions which to someone outside of our community that could see them as very just normal actions, you know, just dusting a shelf or just wiping down a surface, is magical to me. I think for me that is cleansing. And I think that in this case, magical and mundane are intertwined. Another example that comes to mind is the idea of banishment. So for example, if I'm performing a magical action and wanting to banish someone from my life, I'm not just doing a banishing spell that I've crafted, I'm also mentally freeing them from my mind, you know, and then you could arguably, you know, that is the magic happening in action, but there's also little things that combine with the spell, and that in itself is magical. The mundane action of perhaps, you know, leaving a group chat that I'm in them with, or just muting them on social media, you know, little things like that, which I think help you mentally free them from your mind. And I think that is magical in and of itself. You are creating this space within your head that ultimately serves you much better. And I think that that action of that is self-care. If you're banishing a toxic person from your life and someone who only causes you grief, and you're doing the spell, but you're doing the mundane action, you're doing the mental freeing, that all together is a magical action for me. You know, I've talked about this in a prior video where if you're going to manifest something, you need to do the mundane work alongside it, you know, to help the magic take its course. And I think when we get into this idea of mundane before magical and we separate that this is the spell, this is the magic, and this is the physical mundane action that we're doing, I think it creates this unnecessary divide. I think actually those two actions in combination are magical, you know? I think they're both things which help that magic flow. I think for me, not acknowledging that they're intertwined creates this unusual perception of magic, that it exists as this thing which we can't necessarily touch or feel. And I think that actually for me as a animist, as someone who perceives life in the mundane and energy and spirit and just perceives magic in the world, like, have you ever been to a waterfall and just stared at it, you know, just stared at the waterfall and the power from the rushing of the water and just the nature and the earth? It is invigorating, it is completely moving, and I don't think I've ever stood in front of a waterfall and just felt like I was only perceiving, oh well, that's just water running down from an earth and creating a splash. I've never been able to perceive it as just that. It's something that's so moving and it's so powerful and so magical, and I think that you don't necessarily have to go to a waterfall to perceive that there is magic in nature. Magic is everywhere for me. It's in everything. It's this idea that energy and spirit exists in all things. And honestly, I think the issue with my, I guess, rant is that magic is a completely subjective experience. It is something that actually we find really difficult to define. We've tried to, sure, and we might have a decent explanation, but I also think that sometimes it's quite hard to pin down what we really mean and what we really feel and what we're actually experiencing. And what we experience is, I think, is not going to be the same for everyone else. How I perceive and what I'm talking to you about, you could be watching this and think, oh gosh, like, that's not me at all. I completely disagree with you, and that's totally fine. You know, if anything, I encourage disagreement. You shouldn't agree with everything that I'm saying, because you know, I'm not perfect. You don't need to follow everything that I do. But I guess, feel like magic in itself is something which is subjective. So when we're getting into this idea of, oh, okay, well, mundane before magical, what does that magical even look like? What does that magical even mean? Sometimes we perhaps place this division, or it's easy to place this division, because the mundane, the physical world, tends to be something which is easily measurable, it's easily quantifiable, but even then, not really. Sometimes I think that these phrases and these concepts can get a little bit trendy, which is not bad, you know, it's not bad that something gets trendy in our community, but I think sometimes there needs to be a level of reflection and to perceive that actually, is that something that makes sense to me? For me, I'm not saying that you shouldn't say mundane before magical, because it is not wrong. You know, it's not something that is that I think is wrong. It is important, and I will continue to say it. But I guess I'm just opening a question, opening a discussion with you watching, and you can have this with other people. That do you perceive the mundane and the magical as two entirely separate things? Do you? I'm asking you. Might be one-sided right now, but maybe in the comments leave me your answers. But I think that I think it's something which has been on my mind for a while, because I don't necessarily see them as separate. For the spring equinox, I planted some seeds, and that was my celebration, the idea of growth and renewal and new beginnings, and my plants are still doing well, they're all massively grown now, but watching that birth, that growth, was so magical, it was so wonderful. It was something which is so beautiful to see before your eyes, and they're just like herbs in a pot, but they are plant spirits and they're my allies. So I think that looking at things in that way, for me, it's hard for me to look at those plants and just see them as like, oh yeah, they're just, that's mundane, that's plants. Like for me, that plant is a spirit. It has its spirit essence within it. How would I perceive that as mundane before magical? Going alongside this banishing example, it's not just the magical helping the mundane, but the mundane can help the magical too. And this is something that I have seen a lot in the Little Workbook, which I discussed in my daily practice video, which is such a good book, by the way. This book, which I can't believe I'm plugging again in a separate video, I swear, I like don't even know the author or anything, I just really, really love this book. But this whole book encapsulates what I'm about to say. But it's this idea that, you know, improving your mental well-being can, of course, help your spiritual well-being, or your just magical practices, or just your magical skill. So it's this idea in this banishing example, it's this idea of having that mental relief and strengthening that inner alchemy is inherently magical to me, because if I'm improving my mental state, my mind, I can more easily align it with my body and spirit in order to feel that transcendence. When we're looking at mind, body, spirit, these things are interconnected, they're intertwined. They're not necessarily, at least to me, things that are distinctly separate. And sometimes they can be, and perhaps that's where we feel struggle and we feel issues in our being. But, you know, I'm not going to pretend to be a massive expert on all things related to this topic, but I think that there is this level of interconnectedness when we are looking at these three concepts. And so if we're looking at that interconnectedness, why would we look at other things as completely separate, like the mundane and the magical? For me, when we're looking at a plant, like I've discussed before, looking at this idea of the plant's physical matter and the plant's spirit, those things are interlinked, they're intertwined. So it's this idea that mundane and magical don't have to be a separate and distinct thing. The goal for this video wasn't to really give any advice, if I'm going to be honest. It was just something to allow for discussion, or allow for more discussion than what I am seeing in our community. I think that opening this line of thought perhaps may help us perceive this phrase a little bit more critically and with a little bit more nuance. I think sometimes we tend to overemphasize it, and it is good that we are emphasizing it, but I think sometimes we can get a little bit dismissive. I think mundane before magical needs a little bit more nuance. Is that a hot take? Ugh, kind of hate hot takes, so I hope not. But if you disagree with me, that's fine. You know, if you're thinking, oh no, they're completely separate and you're wrong, then that's fine. You know, you can disagree with me, I won't mind. But at least as I see it from an animist perspective, they're not separate to me. So in my Discord server, I actually brought up this discussion. In our debate channel, I presented this topic, and it was really interesting hearing different people's responses. Megan Black from Around the Cauldron, she offered this idea of there being two distinct phrases, you know, mundane over the magical versus magic in the mundane, and I agree with her. I think that they are different concepts, and I think that is what I'm trying to present in this video. I think people say mundane before the magical, mundane over the magical, and they kind of use it too much, and they don't necessarily say magic in the mundane. I think they're kind of blending the two together, which kind of diminishes the latter. So I think that there needs to be this nuance of actually they are two different contexts, and sometimes I find people sort of forget about magic in the mundane as a possibility and as something which is really, really important. For me, magic in the mundane is vital. It is a part of my practice, it is a part of my religious and spiritual beliefs, and my approach to my craft is foundational to my practice. So when I see loads and loads of mundane over the magical, I sort of think, why is this distinction of mundane over the magical? Why is it that it needs to be completely and utterly out of focus over the magical? For me, I think actually there is magic in the mundane, so that emphasis in the former gets quite confusing for me. But again, this is just my perspective, but it was really interesting to have that discussion, and I think that is what I wanted to present to this video, and just engage people's brains and see if you feel the same, or do you massively disagree. So yes, I think I'm gonna stop talking now, because I just keep spacing out and losing my train of thoughts, and yeah, I think I need to go drink some water. Did you enjoy this type of video? It was just me sort of ranting at a camera, and I'm sorry if it's not really massively educational, but I think that is a discussion which should be had more often. If you want to continue this discussion, please, you know, leave something in the comments, or you can come chat to me on my Discord server or on Twitter. I'm at @the_oakwitch, and all the links are found in the description and stuff. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!